Let me just start off with an overview of MSA, and I'm going to cover a little bit of what folks are talking about today, but I want to at least just sort of give you an outline for MSA. I know many of you know what it is because you're experiencing it, but as a neurologist, I think one of the first things people often ask me when they come into my clinic is they were told they were diagnosed with what's called Parkinsonism. Okay, so, Parkinsonism is this, it's really more of a descriptive term, a constellation of symptoms that patients often have. Typically we think of this acronym TRAP, so tremor, typically arresting tremor, and Parkinsonism we call rigidity or stiffness, slowed movement, the most severe form is we call lack of movement, as well as postural instability or problems with falling, okay? Those are the constellation of features we see in Parkinsonism. One of the key features is really slowed movement, okay? Sort of stuck in jello, all right, those slow movements. There are many things that actually cause those symptoms, okay? By far the most common symptom is actually Parkinson's disease, and I list that over here on that slide, shown over here on the left-hand side, okay? So as a neurologist view, this is my view when you guys come into our clinic. MSA is down below, okay? But I want you to just recognize really here that this is the conundrum, and I'm sure all of you, when I see patients in my clinic often, it might be the third, fourth, or fifth neurologist, and I really would like to see that sort of decrease. Obviously, those of you have probably experienced that problem with MSA and getting an early diagnosis. But this is really the conundrum for neurologists when we see patients is what is it, okay? There are what we call secondary causes. This is our job to figure out that. What I mean by secondary causes is things like drugs and stroke, vascular things like that. And there's a whole list of things on that left-hand side shown here. Let me see if is there a pointer? Let's see. Yeah, there we go. There are a bunch of genetic or hereditary causes of Parkinsonism as well that can mimic the symptoms of Parkinson's disease or Parkinson's-like symptoms. And then these atypical Parkinson's disorders. So multiple system atrophy fits into this atypical Parkinson's group. But as you notice, there are several other different atypical Parkinson's disorders. And it's really our job to help you kind of figure this out, okay? I will also point out here that more and more when patients come to our clinics, we are starting to think about what's called the clinical and the pathological features of disease. So back in my mind, I'm kind of thinking, okay, what's going on in that brain of yours? And these are sort of what we're looking at. So Parkinson's disease and many of the Parkinson's disorders are commonly feature a pathology that's called synuclein. So this is a protein pathology. So what's common among all these disorders really is this abnormal protein accumulation in the brain, often in neurons, but also now seen in other supporting cells too. It's common in diseases ranging from Alzheimer's disease to ALS, all the way to Parkinson's disease and multiple system atrophy. This is important, okay? And it will become increasingly important because we're starting to move from what we call symptomatic disease therapies to things we call disease-modifying therapies, DMTs, okay, disease-modifying therapies. And these things are starting to target things that are going on in the brain, okay? This is the goal, okay? We're all kind of thinking about how are we going to slow this disease down and if possible even reverse it, and then that sort of four-letter word that I hate to say, but cure. But I'm really hoping for that. But this is why this is critically important. And you may hear us talk about things called synucleinopathies or tauopathy disorders because we're starting to think about what's going on in your brain more than just sort of the diagnosis, okay? So I just want to raise that here, and we'll bring the pathology in. And later this afternoon, you're going to hear from the researchers here and the scientists that are actually working on this, and you'll see how relevant this really is, okay? But hopefully your docs are thinking this way as well, okay? So one of the big questions really is, that I see in the clinic is really, is it MSA, okay? Is it Parkinson's disease? And so what are those features really that I'm looking for, okay? So there are a number of red flags, okay, that are available for us. So like early problems with gait and balance. Typically, Parkinson's patients actually have this shuffling, slow gait, but they don't really start falling frequently until about 5 years in disease or actually later. With MSA or atypical Parkinson's, this occurs much earlier. Prominent speech or swallow issues, okay? Yeah, Parkinson's disease, we see patients who have sort of this monotone, slow speech, but the type of speech in MSA you'll hear is much different, okay? Could be much more slurred, could be much more effortful, can actually have a little bit of variability in it as well. It's not the same that we see in that disease. Swallow problems, while present in many Parkinson's disorders, are much more a problem in multiple system atrophy and other atypical disorders as well. Is the presentation symmetric or asymmetric? So you may have heard that most Parkinson's patients typically present with one side affected more than the other side. In atypical disorders, sometimes the presentation is affected both sides, so a little bit more symmetric as well. There may be, we call spasticity or other track signs that a neurologist may detect on you. And then, sort of last but not leastly really, frequently we try drugs to treat Parkinson's disorders, and the most common one, or the gold standard drug, is levodopa or L-DOPA, listed here. And it's this poor response that often leads to referral to our clinics to ask, is this Parkinson's disease or not? I will tell you that most Parkinson's disease patients get a good response. MSA, you may get an initial response, but that response wanes quickly, or it may cause side effects and not be responsive. But I will tell you that even in Parkinson's disease patients, not all patients respond to levodopa. So it's not, it's not an automatic sort of thing saying, just because I don't respond to the drug, that doesn't mean you have MSA, okay? There are other features that we need to look at, and those are these sort of plus features. So in the past, we used to refer to these atypical Parkinson's disorders as Parkinson's plus disorders. So Parkinsonism, those constellation of features plus different things. For instance, eye movement problems, problems with sort of learned behaviors or early dementia, that can sort of be clues to a neurologist or a physician that maybe this really isn't just classic Parkinson's disease. One of the key features in multiple system atrophy, and I'll come back to this really, is this we call autonomic features. So the automatic nervous system, things that control things like bowel function, sexual function, urinary function, blood pressure control, and it's just part of the top of the list, okay? And you'll hear more about that later today, can be really clues. So I wanted to give you this little bit of overview here before we go into MSA and specifics, okay? But these are the clues that we use to kind of think, is this something else, okay? I mean, this is really important. So I'm going to jump right into multiple system atrophy. So what really is it, okay? It is one of the most common forms of atypical Parkinsonism. I show sort of an instance and prevalence shown here. In the United States alone, we have about 1 million, well, probably more than 1 million Parkinson's disease patients. So the difference you can see here, we're talking about 20 to 40,000 patients. So much less prevalent, but still a fairly common atypical Parkinson's disorder, okay, defined. Onset's typically in the 50s, so roughly, on average, the median is roughly around 58, okay? And it comes in different forms. So I like to talk to my patients, and I think some of you have heard me talk about MSA as having multiple faces, okay? It went by different names earlier on, so historically, you'll see here listed on here these old names, okay? Shy-Drager. This one maybe people haven't heard so much, but striatal neurodegeneration. And lastly, olivopontocerebellar atrophy, okay? These are still terms that are used, but sort of these are older terms. Now we kind of refer to these diseases all as multiple system atrophy. It has a few different phenotypes. So phenotype's the way it presents, okay? And those phenotypes are either predominantly Parkinson's, okay? Parkinson's meaning, so this Shy-Drager and striatal neurodegeneration presents often with a predominant Parkinson's phenotype. And it very much overlaps Parkinson's disease, particularly early on in disease, and can be difficult to distinguish there. The key features really here is the association with autonomic symptoms, okay? Things like orthostasis, which is postural hypotension, okay? So you're standing up, you get low blood pressures, or even labile blood pressures, can be urinary issues. The other key feature here is sort of more rapid progression. Lastly, there's also this, we call a cerebellar phenotype. So cerebellum is that thing that hangs off the back of your head that helps with coordination of movement and behavior, okay? Patients who have this type of disease actually present often with predominant problems with coordination, balance, speech, often may present sort of like a drunk-like sort of speech and walking, okay? There can be overlapping features. I'm going to talk about these each in detail. But the key here was this was sort of named olivopontocerebellar atrophy based on the imaging findings that we see, and I'll show you a picture of that in just a second here. So why are these all now lumped together into multiple system atrophy? Well, it's because, coming back to that clinical pathological issue, we've learned about the pathology, okay? And the pathology really is this thing here on the right-hand side. This is something you cannot see on an MRI, okay? This is a neuropathological feature that we see. These are actually cells in the brain that contain what are called Lewy bodies, okay? These are protein deposits within a cell that are abnormal, okay? And in multiple system atrophy, these deposits are most frequently found in not the neurons, but the supporting cells we call glial cells. And actually, they were originally called what we call glial cytoplasmic inclusions. Okay, so these protein deposits you can think of as sort of, it's a wastebasket in the cell and it gets really large and full. The cell cannot take the trash out anymore, okay? And you imagine if the trash builds up in your house and you can't get the trashman to take it out, your house is not going to function. The same thing happens in the cell. It doesn't function right, okay? And this leads to degeneration in the brain, okay? So this is a common feature in all of these diseases, so hence we went back and called them multiple system atrophy together. But again, to just point out the different phenotypes. So I'm going to just kind of go over a little bit about the Parkinson's type and give you sort of some features here. Sort of the balance of sort of features that we see here. Parkinson's disease patients have sort of this hypophonic speech. They have a tremor, asymmetric presentation. I mentioned that sort of more symmetric kind of features of sort of their tremor here. You may see all these autonomic symptoms, more spastic, sort of different kind of speech features earlier on. The tremor in multiple system atrophy sometimes looks different than Parkinson's disease as well. Instead of a pill-rolling tremor, sometimes it could be sort of a mixed tremor, both sort of postural as well as even at rest, and sometimes it has this higher frequency and a jerky quality to it as well. There are a bunch of other features that we see in multiple system atrophy that give us clues as physicians to this disease. You'll hear a lot about speech issues, you'll hear a lot about sleep issues in this disease. There may be, we call dystonic features. These are features where you get pulling of muscles, and it may lead to either pulling muscles in the limbs as well as the neck and the trunk, making you either lean forward like a dropped head, okay? These early falls here. I'll point you out at the bottom here, a couple other key features are these issues that I've mentioned already. The presence of autonomic symptoms or symptoms that affect the automatic nervous systems are much more frequent in this. They're not absent in Parkinson's disease, they're still common there, but the comparison here, much more frequent and much more severe frequently. Levodopa in patients does help, but over time starts to fail. For many patients, and in some patients actually you can see a specific type of side effects which are called abnormal movements, dyskinesias. They could be oral facial kind of dyskinesias that we see sometimes, or it can lead to confusion, or in some cases just exacerbate the blood pressure or other issues that are in patients, okay? Key here listed really is this poor, sometimes unsustained response to drugs. That can be sort of a clue. The main clue really here is this progression, okay? With many patients, I think as you've seen here, the progression is different than Parkinson's disease. If you've been in a support group with PD, you may start to see that, okay, I'm not progressing the same way. My symptoms are much more severe to the guy who's got Parkinson's disease. I'm already in a wheelchair, why is that person not? That's because of this more rapid progression, okay? So let me say just a few words about this cerebellar type, or we call multiple system atrophy C. So most often this is a sporadic disease, okay? A bit closer to a equal male to female predominance. The onset is somewhat more variable. You can have both the cerebellar features as well as Parkinson's mixed in there. There are other features that people see in this disease, eye impairment, movements. You can have those other autonomic symptoms as well. You can have even some progressive memory and thinking problems, or we call dementia. Emotional lability can be seen too as well in this patient population. What we have to kind of distinguish here really is that there are, well, just like with the Parkinson's, there are many things that cause Parkinson's features. There are many things also that cause ataxia or cerebellar features too. There are many ataxic disorders. If there is a family history, we have to rule out familial forms of ataxia. There's a whole bunch of different versions of genetic ataxias that we rule out. There's even inflammatory autoimmune types of ataxias as well that we have to rule out too. So it's important to kind of look at that. So what are some of the things that we can do besides doing an exam? So the key thing really is history and exam. There are some ancillary tests that we sometimes use to help to distinguish these, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Dr. Chomsky is going to talk a little bit about autonomic testing. So some of the tests listed here, like the tilt table test, thermoregulatory sweat testing. I'm going to talk more about sleep studies. So sleep can be very much a challenge in this disorder, and there are multiple problems with sleep. The quality can be affected. People can have sleep apnea, stridor. We'll talk more about this thing called REM sleep behavior disorder, which is common in Parkinson's, and we call synuclein pathology disorders, which MSA fits into, and other features. And then lastly, one of the most common thing we do is get brain imaging, and this can be helpful in some cases, but is primarily supportive, not necessarily always diagnostic, okay? So these are tests that we use. Here's just an example of imaging findings that we see in some patients. This is a more severe feature. Hard to see these sometimes early on, but sometimes we see atrophy within the parts of the brain called the basal ganglia, shown here. So these are parts of the basal ganglia, and we see sort of shrinkage of a part of the brain we call the caudate and putamen in particular. And sometimes we can see this shrinkage, and we can even see a slit, sort of hyper-intense sort of sign next to the brain in this particular area. Pathologically, I think Dr. Nes-Dixon may talk to you about this as well. We see a significant degeneration in this part of the brain too. In patients that have this olivopontocerebellar atrophy, we look at this part of the brain. This is the cerebellum that hangs off the back of the brain, this part of the brain here. Hey, sort of, I've oriented you guys. This is the nose, this is the back of the head, top of the head. This is sort of a middle view of the brain shown here. So what you see is the higher brain, you see the brainstem here on the cerebellum. This is a cerebellum that looks relatively small. There's also this part of the brain we call the pons. So we call that pontine, shows atrophy or shrinkage as well. And on the other side here, this is just a slice through this portion of the brain, right down here. We can see shrinkage of this part of the brain. So that's why it was named sort of olivopontocerebellar atrophy. And sometimes we actually see a characteristic sort of gliosis in the pons, actually, this sort of scarring that kind of gives this sort of hot cross bun sign. This is seen later on. It's not always seen in patients, but these are some of the clues that we use as clinicians to figure out, is this MSA? Okay. They're not always diagnostic. This can be seen in other disorders, but these are some of the clues that we use. Okay. So I wanted to just give a brief overview. I'm going to rely on my partner here, Dr. Rodriguez, to kind of go over a little bit more of the treatments, but just as an overview, how do we approach multiple system atrophy? Well, it's a multidisciplinary approach, first of all. I'm going to come back to that. It takes a team, so I don't do it all by myself. The treatment, likewise, is multi-symptomatic, okay, in terms of treatment. So taking the different aims, so for instance, the Parkinson's part, I mentioned that a lot of people get put on Parkinson's medications. So the most common one is levodopa. Most patients should get a trial of levodopa, okay? And what by that really, the dose trial should be an adequate dose trial as best as possible. Frequently we see patients who get a trial of maybe 1 tab of levodopa 3 times a day, and that's it, and they get taken off. That's probably inadequate. We like to see patients pushed on the dose to see if it actually really helps them. So getting an adequate trial can be really important. Some other medications can be used, and I think we'll talk more about those as well. But different medications for this disease can also cause side effects. So one of the key problems is really that blood pressure, those automatic nervous system things. So coming to that, okay, there's treatments for the autonomic symptoms, for instance, the low blood pressures that people have. There's some conservative treatments, and you'll hear us talk about some of these medications, everything from fludrocortisone to midodrine and droxidopa for, moderating blood pressure. Gastrointestinal symptoms. So Dr. Marissa is going to talk a little bit about this today and go into constipation, gastroparesis. There are multiple problems, as you all know. And then urinary function. So Dr. Moy is going to discuss issues there as well. Urological evaluations are very important in patients who have urologic problems. And there are ways that we can treat some of these issues for patients as well. And then last thing, I'm going to go over sort of the sleep issues and potential treatments for sleep issues. Sleep apnea needs to be evaluated. Stridor is a big issue. So stridor is that gasping for breath that can occur, can be very severe, okay? It needs to be treated. And then this thing that we call REM sleep behavior disorder or dream enactment that can be quite violent, actually. Hurt your partner as well as yourself, falling out of bed and injuring needs to be treated too. And there are things that we can do to treat that, for instance, melatonin versus clonazepam. And we'll talk about that today. I do want to take a few minutes to sort of emphasize, again, disciplinary treatment is really key for this disorder, okay? That's why we brought our team here, and I think many of you recognize this. It really takes a team to treat this disease. No matter how many medications I can talk about, without physical occupational therapists, without speech pathologists who help you with your speech and swallowing issues, we really couldn't treat this disorder well. It's really important to have nursing and social services as well for this disease. So these are all the key team players that we have that are really necessary. I do want to just take a brief mention to talk about palliative care as part of the team too, okay? Palliative care is treatment that's directed at comfort, okay? It's not just hospice, okay? And I listed a few things here actually to talk about. So this is focusing on comfort and quality of life, okay? Treating pain and suffering, your well-being, these are all important things, okay? Spirituality, into life, how do you end your life on your own terms, okay? Clearly hospice is part of this. I do want to mention here, this is not about giving up, okay? It's not about getting rid of your doctor. I stay part of patients to the end as a physician. All right, this is really trying to help you for a disease where we have to talk frankly, really, this is a progressive disease, okay, that we don't have a cure yet for. We're really working hard on that, but we have to take care of our patients from beginning to end, and I think it is important, and to do it on our terms is really important, but I want you to know this is really part of that, okay. Lastly, I want to just mention sort of where the hope really lies here in this disease. The amount of research in MSA has exploded, and this is just sort of a basic overview, okay? I like to talk about sort of bins, so there are sort of 3 bins of research that I want people to understand about, and I'm not going to really have a lot of research talk this afternoon, but the 3 bins really are 1 for symptomatic treatment, 2 for treatment that will either slow the disease, okay, or stop it in its tracks, okay, and then 3, that 3rd bin we call the cure, okay. We're actually not doing so well in all of these bins, okay. Symptomatic therapy has been limited largely to the Parkinson's part and this part, the orthostatic hypotension stuff, okay. We have some other treatments we're going to talk about today, but we need a lot more research in that area. This 2nd bin, slowing down disease, we call disease-modifying therapies. We've made some progress, so that's really hopeful, okay. And I'm just going to show you a few things here, okay. So listed on here is just some examples of where we're at. This is an amazing slide, actually, to me. There are a lot of new drugs that are actually out there that are being tried for symptomatic orthostatic hypotension. These are the disease-modifying therapies. They range they range from basically IVIG to sort of stem cell therapies that many have asked about. There are a bunch of drugs that are sort of in the experimental phase listed here, and there are a whole bunch of medications that are still being looked at in the lab, okay? So there's a lot of things coming up. So I know people are interested in trials and they want to be in them now, but just understand there are more coming right behind that. So this is a very hopeful time for MSA patients, okay? I don't have time to go through each one of these, but I just wanted you to notice the different mechanisms that people are actually targeting this disease for each one of these different treatments, okay? They all act on different parts of the brain and different parts of the system of the body to actually help treatment, okay? So I wanted to give you this overview. I hope that was helpful. We're going to go into each one of these in detail briefly, okay? This is our clinic, so thank you very much for your time, and we'll have questions in. We're all going to kind of join, so each of us will give a talk. We'll kind of join at the panel right after the break, and you guys, please write your questions down. We'll take them at the end here. We'll collect everything, and then we'll try to answer all of them together, okay? Thanks very much. All right, so I'm going to ask Dr. Rodriguez, my colleague here, to join me up.